All right, let's talk about the invisible architecture that holds every single company together. We're talking about its organizational structure. You can think of it like a blueprint, the master plan that shows how all the different pieces are supposed to fit together to build something amazing. So think about this for a second. You've got a bunch of smart, talented people. Now what? How do you actually arrange them so they're not just creating chaos, but are actually working together to achieve a goal? How do you turn that crowd into a real, coordinated powerhouse of a team? Well, the answer really starts with this simple definition. An organization at its heart is just a deliberate arrangement of people who are trying to accomplish a specific purpose. And that applies to literally everything, from a tiny two-person startup to a massive global corporation, a hospital, you name it. Okay, so you have this deliberate arrangement, right? But for it to actually work, you need a plan. You need that blueprint we were talking about. This is what's going to define the structure for success and lay out the whole foundation for how work actually gets done. And that formal plan is what we call the organizational structure. It's the system that coordinates everybody's activities, makes it super clear who does what, and shows how every single role fits into the bigger picture. I mean, without it, you've just got a bunch of people bumping into each other, hoping for the best. And the whole process, the act of actually creating or tweaking this blueprint, that's got a name too. Organizational design. And it's a really powerful idea. Managers who do this well aren't just drawing boxes on a chart. No, they are literally the architects of human collaboration. All right, so if you're the architect, how do you actually start drawing up this blueprint? Well, it turns out it all comes down to 6 fundamental building blocks, 6 key decisions that are going to shape the entire organization. These are the big 6, the absolute core components of any organizational blueprint. We've got work specialization, departmentalization, chain of command, span of control, centralization, and formalization. So let's dive in and see how each one works. First up, work specialization. You might have heard this called the division of labor. It's all about breaking down a huge task into smaller, separate jobs. The classic example, of course, is an assembly line. One person puts on the wheels, the next person installs the engine, and so on. The whole point is that by focusing on just one little thing, each person becomes an expert and super efficient at it. But, and this is a huge but, there's a catch. If you take specialization too far, you run into what experts call human diseconomies. Basically, people get bored out of their minds, they get stressed, they feel totally disconnected from the final product. And what happens? Quality tanks and people start quitting. It is a really delicate balancing act. Okay, so once you've broken down all the work into these specialized jobs, you've got to group them back together in a way that makes sense, right? That's departmentalization, and there are a bunch of ways to do it. You could group people by their function, like putting all the marketing folks in one department, or you could do it by division, like by product line, where you are geographically, or even by the type of customer you serve. And this right here, this highlights one of the classic trade-offs, one of the toughest calls a leader has to make. If you group by function, you get incredible efficiency. The downside? You create these silos where the marketing team has no idea what the finance team is doing. On the other hand, if you group by division, you get much closer to your customers. But now you might have 5 different marketing teams for 5 different products, and that gets really expensive really fast. All right, number 3 on our list is the chain of command. This is the classic food chain you see in most companies. It's that unbroken line of authority that shows you exactly who reports to whom, from the CEO at the very top all the way down to the front lines. It's all about authority, the right to give orders, and responsibility, the obligation to get the job done. Next up, we've got something called span of control. Now, this sounds kind of complicated, but it's actually super simple. It's just the number of employees a manager can effectively lead. And this one decision has a massive impact on the overall shape of a company. So, let's look at an example. Let's say you have about 4,000 employees. If you decide each manager only oversees 4 people, that's a narrow span, you end up with a very tall organization. You'd need a whopping 7 layers of management. And you can just imagine how slow communication gets when a message has to travel up and down all those levels. But now, check this out. What if we widened that span? So each manager is in charge of 8 people. For the same number of employees, you suddenly only need 5 levels of management. This creates a flat structure, which is leaner, way more flexible, and it usually gives employees a lot more freedom. Decision number 5 is all about power. Who gets to make the calls? In a centralized organization, all the big decisions are made at the very top. But in a decentralized company, that power is pushed down the ladder, empowering the employees who are actually on the front lines to make their own decisions. And finally, we have formalization. This is basically about rules. How many do you have? A highly formalized company has super detailed job descriptions and strict procedures for just about everything. A company with low formalization, though, is much more fluid. It gives employees the freedom to figure things out for themselves. Okay, so you've made all 6 of these decisions. You've gone through the whole checklist. What you end up with isn't some random mix. Your choices naturally push you toward one of 2 master blueprints. One that's really rigid and controlled, or one that's super flexible and adaptive. And this is where it all comes together beautifully. On one side, you have the mechanistic model. Think of a tall, rigid skyscraper. It's built for pure efficiency, with tons of specialization and rules for everything. On the other side, you've got the organic model. Think of a flexible, collaborative workshop. It's built for innovation, with teams from different departments working together and decisions being made all over the place. Now, here is the absolute key takeaway of this whole thing. Neither the skyscraper nor the workshop is inherently better. There is no single best blueprint. The right structure depends entirely on what the company is trying to do and the world it's operating in. See, it all comes down to fit. It's about matching the blueprint to the job. If your whole strategy is about being the low-cost leader in a really stable market, then that rigid, mechanistic model is probably perfect. But if you're in a crazy, fast-changing market where you need to innovate constantly just to survive, you absolutely need that flexible, organic structure. And, the world of work doesn't stand still, right? So these blueprints are constantly evolving. We're seeing this huge shift toward more dynamic, boundaryless designs, things like self-managing teams, project-based work, and flexible arrangements that, frankly, just weren't even possible a few decades ago. So that brings us to you. Think about where you work. Can you see the blueprint? Can you tell if it's built like a rigid skyscraper or more like a flexible workshop? And maybe the most important question of all, is it the right blueprint for the job?